Persuaders, I hope you're doing well out there. This concept that we're exploring in this lecture is among the most important in behavioral economics, in psychology, even in evolutionary psychology, and of course in communication. And we're going to use this one concept to view and explore the influence of one of the most important books on persuasion that has been published in the past 30, 40 years or so. The concept we're talking about is called loss aversion, but you might see it if you look it up as loss motivation. Some folks call it negativity bias, but we're going to call it loss aversion for simplicity's sake, and I'll try to stay consistent there. And we're going to use the concept of loss aversion to talk about a range of persuasive activities that have been covered in the persuasion literature in the past 30 or 40 years. So what are we talking about? Well, let me tell you a few stories that illustrate the principle in action. So if I was to offer you a chance to earn $20 or lose $20, but the chances were 50-50, how would you feel about it? Well, in most studies, what happens is that if a person like myself is offered a coin flip, and if I get the coin flip right, if I call it right, I get $20. But if I get the coin flip wrong, I lose $20. Most people think that's a bad deal. Now, that's a curious reaction because the amount of money you gain and lose is the same, and the odds, of course, are 50-50, so the odds are both in your favor and not in your favor, but the vast majority of people think that this is a pretty raw deal. Another way that we can talk about this kind of phenomenon in story form is insurance companies. Insurance companies have learned overwhelmingly that if they talk about the risks that you face as a homeowner, as a car owner, as another form of property ownership, as just a person who has a life and needs to buy life insurance, the more they talk about risks, the more they can add on cost to your policy. So you have a basic policy, and then they say, well, would you like to protect yourself against fires? Many people will say yes. Would you like to protect yourselves against earthquakes? Yes. Would you like to protect yourself against other kinds of natural disasters? Perhaps yes. And then all of a sudden you don't have one insurance program, you have 11 or 12 different kinds of insurance to protect yourself against a lot of different threats, both real and imaginary. Another study from the early 1980s showed this kind of principle as well. 1982, and this should be near and dear to us now in an economy that has inflationary pressures, is that the price of eggs goes up 10%. Well, when the price of eggs goes up 10%, economists see that there is a nearly corresponding decrease in demand. Price of eggs goes up 10%, the demand for eggs goes down 8%. However, the next year, when the price of eggs diminished 10%, so it's back to its pre-1982 value, so it goes down 10%, what happens to demand? Well, it only increases 3%. And we see this in product testing and demand testing over time overwhelmingly. When there is this kind of fear of loss, when the prices shoot up, demands shoot down at roughly a corresponding ratio with many products. But when these items become a little bit cheaper or when they will resume being their normal cost in our day-to-day experience, demand does not shoot up a corresponding degree. People are more motivated by losing money in a sense than they are by gaining money. To that very end, some of the most famous companies of the 20th century have struggled with this as well, with the digital, technical, internet revolution. Among the most famous companies in my grandparents' lifetime, in my parents' lifetime, and in my lifetime is the company Kodak, a photography company that made cameras and they printed pictures. Well, they were so popular, in fact, that I can remember as a kid getting together for pictures. Maybe it was a school picture day, maybe we were doing pictures at Easter or some family holiday. And I can remember my grandparents, I can remember my parents, and I can remember people that we were friends with just saying, now that's a Kodak moment, or let's see that Kodak smile. Kodak was so prominent that it had seeped into our normal day-to-day interactions when we were taking pictures of one another. In any case, Kodak filed for bankruptcy in 2012, and one of the major reasons why they filed for bankruptcy, the business literature says, is because they were not quick to act. They overvalued what they had. They were fearful of losing business, and that fear led them to not invest in the kinds of technologies that would allow them to survive in a post-printing, internet, Instagram-dominated era. And so as companies pivoted into digital technologies like Fuji and other photography companies that survived and even thrived and currently have a $20 billion year-to-year revenue, Kodak went the other direction and had to file for bankruptcy in 2012. We see this idea of loss aversion or negativity bias or loss motivation really coming out of the the behavioral psychology, the evolutionary psychology literature, which shows how lots of animals, human beings in particular, have brains that are motivated to keep them safe. And so we have these kinds of biases that make our attention attend to things that are threatening to our current situation, to the status quo. And we process those things on both a rational level, right? We understand the threats that are coming, but we also can over process those on an emotional level. We can feel the kinds of stressors that those threats to our current station might bring. The most famous example of this from behavioral economics and the psychology literature actually comes from two Nobel Prize winners. And this is Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman came up with this idea called loss aversion. At least they put the term to the older concept, loss aversion, in 1979. And through a series of experiments in 1979 that have been replicated up until 2015, 2016, when the newest studies have come out, have shown that not only are people more motivated by loss than they are by gain, but their number was that people are 2.3 times more motivated by loss than they are by gain. And subsequent research in 2015 and 2016, which I just mentioned, replicated Kahneman and Tversky's findings, except they said they were underselling it. People are 5 times more motivated by loss than they are by gain. So the theory that we're going for, the thesis of this theory is that gains occupy a far less significant cognitive function for us than do potential losses. Put differently, losses are more important than gains when it comes to persuasion and motivation. And we can even see this show up in brain imaging studies in which people are hooked up to brain scans. Those brain scans are looking at areas of the brain that process joy from gains, the pleasure we get from gain seeking, as well as the fears, the stresses we experience on a cranial level, on a brain level, from potential losses. And so in these kinds of studies, they'll hook people up to brain scanning imagery and show them positive, negative, and neutral image. A positive image might be people having a really good time and smiling and laughing. A neutral image might be an image of a light socket or a plate. And then a threatening image, a negative image, might be a gun pointed directly at them or an image of violence or harm or something like that. And overwhelmingly, where do we find the most brain activity? We find activity for all three, so the brain is registering all 3 different kinds of images. But the most kinds of images that result in the most kinds of brain activities are negative images and firing up in the amygdala and the insula in the center of the brain, which process threats to the status quo and the kinds of fears that we experience as human beings. So what we're going to do for the rest of this time is talk about the influence of loss motivation on theories of persuasion.